So, Bruce, thank you again for joining us on the Leaders of Tomorrow podcast. And we get to do it video wise. Isn't that great for a couple old guys with no hair?
Exactly. Thanks for having me back.
Thanks for coming. And it's been so awesome seeing your career progress and just, again, as an entrepreneur who's really committed to a vision, a better vision of the world. I know that's what you are, and it's a real tough slug to really try to make a difference. And I'm really excited to digging into, just your story. So
sounds great.
Thank you.
Sounds great. This is where I say it's all because of Student Works.
No.
Oh, sorry. That's later. That's later.
That's later.
Okay.
And we're more subtle. We're more subtle, Bruce. So love it. Okay, so let's think back to who Bruce Hodges was before Student Works.
Wow, that's going back. So, grew up in Barrie, small town. I did have an entrepreneurial background, so I started my first business in grade 8, lawn mowing company. Actually had half the people listening won't even understand what these things are, but I had business cards and an answering machine. So it dates back to that. I was always a bit of a shy kid. Surprised my parents valedictorian in public school, so that was a bit of a shock. And then sort of came out of my shell a little bit in high school, I think, and then a bit more in university. And went to Laurier, so huge Laurier fan. Big shout out to the Laurier crew. And then just stumbled across what was then Student Painters, now Student Works. In the atrium, and you guys were recruiting, and the rest is history.
Yeah, no, for sure. And so thinking back, like, what were some of the things you discovered in the few summers that you operated really successfully? But what were some of the things you discovered about yourself and about business, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the first is probably putting yourself out there because you have to. So, and there's offshoots from that in that. Hard work is correlated with your success. It's probably one of the main tenets of the business I'm sure you teach.
Yes.
And, if you're sitting in a dorm room watching TV and not out delivering flyers or whatever your marketing techniques are now, social and other things, we were always flyers. And for everybody listening, you need to find a vintage Chris Thompson door hanger. So we actually had boxes and boxes of door hangers that we used, which was actually an image of yours truly, Chris. I probably still have one somewhere. I should dig that out.
It's all true. Every once in a while, I'll drop it in the coaches chat, and people go, "Oh my God, Chris had hair," and I did.
It's a classic. It was you on the door hanger. Do you still have door hangers?
We have flyers, but we don't do door hangers. People complain about things hanging on their door because then it says we're not here. So we no longer do that.
Cool. I mean, again, if I think back to the hard work and correlation of work to output, because it's really, or at least then, I'm sure it's probably not changed. The number of quotes you do is directly correlated with how much business you do. Yes. Which is really correlated to how many cold calls and other things you do in the marketing front. So it's probably the earliest direct education correlation on work gets you to success ultimately.
Yes. Yeah. No. And I think that is, and it's a numbers game and that sort of mindset and just I think it's a great way to start a career for that purpose, sort of seeing 100%. That connection. And so in leaving Student Works, what was next for you? Or Student Painters?
So Student Painters at the time. So I opened up Barrie. So Barrie was a new franchise at the time. I think I did like 73,000, which some of them will be like, oh, you don't need 73,000, but that was 1986, 7, somewhere in there.
Inflated dollars. That's
and then the second year I did 115,000, and I had major jaw surgery. I was out for a couple of weeks, so still managed to do all that. Third year was district manager in Manitoba, and then. A story I've only started telling recently, which is tied to Parachute, which we'll talk about, is I went out with a new franchise. So I actually was hired by a competitor to Student Works to do some recruiting, recruited a few guys, and then they convinced me to take on a franchise in Toronto. Net new, no brand recognition, thought I could do it, and I failed. And it didn't go well. And as you'll hear in my story later, I was convinced to file bankruptcy, which I shouldn't have done, in retrospect, and we can talk about that. So I literally started my career as a part-time teller in the basement of a bank branch of TD Bank in Kitchener-Waterloo, knew nothing about financial services, and quickly fell in love with it and built a very long career in financial services, like 30 plus years.
Right. The one thing I haven't asked you about is what like the beyond the financial setback, what was the setback for Bruce? Like of going through that?
And we talk about that in Parachute too. I have spent time with reporters and others as well. And one of the things I say is, if you and I could easily go out for a beer or coffee or whatever, and we could easily talk about physical health. I mean, you're getting older and things are breaking down, so we could talk about that. Or mental health on the back of COVID. We could probably talk about mental health. And now we could probably even get into, marital relations, kids, probably gender and orientation and racial stuff a little bit. It's still a bit sensitive, but those would all be potential topics we could talk about. Under no circumstances are you going to say, but Bruce, how are you doing financially?
Right.
And so it's the last domino to fall.
Right.
So I think it's important to be able to talk about it, but I buried this for 30 years.
Yeah.
And it used to crop up. So I was CEO of ING Malaysia, big job. My approval had to be gazetted with the Prime Minister because I had a bankruptcy like 25 years earlier for a small amount of money. Anyway, it's something that just has haunted me throughout my career. Not haunted me in that it hurt me, but I was so embarrassed about it, I wouldn't talk about it. So you asked the question. So I was embarrassed and ashamed, and it shouldn't have happened, but you can't get it off. You can't pay it back. You can't do it. I actually worked in a restaurant to pay all my painters, which is technically probably not even legal under bankruptcy laws.
Yeah.
So I essentially paid it all back except for the franchise fee, which I should have negotiated of anyway. Yeah. So it shouldn't happen. But I was embarrassed, ashamed, and I think my parents did it to prove a point. So they basically dropped me off at the trustee and said, "You're declaring bankruptcy." The trustee collected a large fee for it, so they had a motivation. And nobody sat down and said, "Well, hey, we could negotiate out of this or fix it." So it was embarrassment and shame. And that happens this is the biggest problem with the space that we're dealing with is people don't want to talk about it. So they don't get the help. Yeah. And even if you're not in financial difficulty, kicking the can down the road is easy. So I bet you most of the people that are listening to the podcast don't have a financial plan and they defer it, they delay it. And we should talk a bit about that because that I think is one of the core tenets. If you get anything out of this conversation, how you manage your finances is super important.
Yeah. Yeah. And well, just to share, because you've kicked the door open, I remember a time being hundreds of thousands of dollars upside down. We expanded to the US. We lost our visa, came back, creditors calling the house. We expanded the business on credit card debt. Not a great plan, Bruce, but we did, overconfident. And now what's fortunate about the circumstances is I was well advised, and it was like, oh, okay, hold on, and we did negotiate some debt. Never went bankrupt. We understood our choices really rationally. We had a good core business. That's the business we're talking about here in Ontario and
the business
Canada.
Survived.
And the business survived and then thrived and got through those challenges. So one of the things about entrepreneurs is many people have stories like that and challenges like that they overcome, and it's really, really difficult sorting these things out on your own.
Yeah, and that's another tenet. And again, I'm learning it again in the startup land is you need to be appropriately worried about failing.
Yes.
And I say not worried about failing, because I think if you're just cavalier about it, then you're probably going to fail.
Yes.
You shouldn't be paralyzed by it. Yeah. And, but it's the reality, 90% of startups fail, and that's what I'm doing now. Yeah. It is a hard reality when I look down at, it could fail, and you've got investors and you got staff and you got everything else, but it is a reality of it. And, but it sounds like you got some good advice, and it's not easy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Ray Dalio of Bridgewater and Associates, I know you know of him, but for our leaders, one of the most successful hedge fund managers, he says, well, if you worry, you don't need to worry. But if you don't worry, you better worry. Yep. So it's finding that balance.
Productive worry.
Yes, productive worry, and just kind of that. So let's move forward in your career, maybe some early spots. One of the things I always love to do for our leaders is a lot of time they'll look at somebody who just has had just an incredible, degree of success. I hope you're okay if I can say that, Bruce. And then it's like, well, how did that happen? And but and it's sort of looking back, but what sort of choices did you make? And what were those choices as you went along?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, the getting a job at TD was happenstance. Right. So I moved back to Waterloo after the dust was settling on all the mess that we just talked about. And the guy I moved in with was working at TD Bank and got me a job. So right. And then they opened up hiring into the management training program, and I applied and got in. Mm-hmm. But then one of the big lessons is I have an expression that I always try and use, which is, what would have to be true to make this great? Okay. I don't think I had that expression then,
no.
But I would categorize it as that now. And that's always advice I give to people in that, and use an example. If you're applying for a job, or there's a job that comes up and it's not quite perfect, if you say, well, what would have to be true to make this great? And how do I make that happen? Because usually you can negotiate it, figure it out, suggest it. And that's probably in those early days. So one of the things I'd graduated from Laurier, wrote my securities license, I wrote my GMAT and started my MBA, but I did my MBA at Laurier as well. And you could do self-study credits. So I actually negotiated with them to do a couple extra, and I did some product development and launches for TD, but as a lender, which was unusual, unheard of. But I just reached out to the people in head office and started doing this, and they were keen to it. So I did a leveraged mutual fund loan product, which we launched in the branch, which was quite cool. In parallel, I did some research as part of my MBA for the Canadian Bankers Association, and got funded to go to Germany.
Wow.
And so some crazy stuff. And that was I still remember that very distinctly. Like the day I landed in Germany, I was like, oh boy, like I'm going to have to I'm here for 2 weeks. I got to produce research, but I'd put myself out there and got it, which was quite cool. Like I was meeting with the Bundesbank, which is a central bank, and others and this is back again, slightly humorous probably for people listening to the podcast, but I arranged all the meetings by fax, because there was no email, yes. Which people are going to be like, well, that's bizarre. But so I think that would be one of the first things, was putting myself out there. That led to...
And if we could pause there as well, like one of the, and I want to point out, I really believe one of the things that is created when we think about a business from an entrepreneurial viewpoint, you see opportunities. So you saw opportunities and then, okay, let's go do this. Most people, when they go to their job, see, I've got to, I don't know, do my job as a teller. I've got to do my job in all the different roles as the management trainee. They move around. But you were seeing things differently. You were seeing things much more broad.
Yeah, and I think, again, taking that opportunity and putting yourself out there, it's kind of that combination. Like when I talk to people that are graduating or finishing jobs, it's sort of like, okay, what do you want to do? What kind of business? What country? But then reach out to the CEOs.
Yes.
And people are like, what do you mean? And it's like, so put yourself, and you'll see that is a theme through my career. And maybe I'm a little bit crazy, I don't know, but it's led to all kinds of interesting scenarios. And we'll probably talk about many of them. It's also how I met my wife.
Fantastic.
That sounds a bit strange, but not because I put myself out there with her, but it's happenstance that led to that. And actually all of these things, even in those TD Bank days, led to multiple things throughout my career. And we'll come back to that. So from there, teller, personal lender, commercial lender. And by this point, I'd published that research on deregulation of insurance for banks. And that led me to a job at RBC Insurance, which is as a product manager for insurance. And this is another one of those stories. So I was not super happy in my job. I'd applied for a product management role, which was 2 rungs up. And they called me and said, you're absolutely the guy for the job, but we can't justify giving you the role because it's 2 jumps up. And I didn't know they knew my background. At the time, I remember thinking this was because of my personal financial history, which they knew, or anyway, for whatever reason, I'm like, okay, this is time to go. 5 years in. And I was reading in the newspaper and there was an ad for a product manager for insurance, for RBC Insurance. I'm like, perfect. Anyway, I was camping at the time. And I was reading the paper, saw this ad, and all my buddies were making this big pot of corn, and they dumped the water on me, and it got the paper wet and me wet, and as these idiots do. And I folded up the paper and stuck it under the front seat of my buddy's Jeep. And then about 3 weeks later, I was like, oh shit, I forgot this. So I ran down to the parking garage, got it out, and I called them, and they said, it's closed. We're interviewing tomorrow, so it's already started. Send us your CV. So the next day I took the day off and I showed up, and I said, and she's like, oh, thank you for bringing in your CV. And I'm like, no, you don't understand. I'm not insane. I'm not crazy, but I'm going to wait. So tell the hiring manager that I'm here. And if anybody's late, doesn't show up, they have time on lunch, whatever, I'll just sit here. And lo and behold, the story ends. I got the job, which also happens to be what led to me meeting my wife, which is what I was talking about. And I guess my point there is, these small things, like if you think of like the butterfly effect or whatever, like that totally changed the trajectory of my personal and professional life.
Yes. And most people won't do what needs to be done. There was a breakdown. He saw a job. He knows he's capable of getting the job. He knows he's ready to get the job. And there was a breakdown. So let's just make up for it. Let's just go and hang out. And it says something to an HR person. Here's a guy staying all day. We'll freeze him out. No, he's staying all day. He's still there. Now, this guy's still there. Okay, that says a whole bunch about who you are.
Yep. Yeah. And I got the job for those reasons. And
for sure.
The woman who hired me is still a good friend. She lives in the UK. Every time she comes back, we have dinner. So then went from there. I was headhunted into Canada Trust, which you guys the people on the would now know as TD Canada Trust. It was the last trust company. And I was hired to run small business credit, business lines and loans. About 6 months in, they gave me the commercial mortgage book, so it took me up to about a $4 billion credit portfolio. And I actually left after a year. And the reason was, roll back the tape to TD Bank, and one of the products I wanted to launch was an auto financing unit. And I wrote to the guy who I knew in head office and said, we should do this. And he said, well, actually, we're about to roll it out. So by this point, by the time they rolled it out, I was the assistant manager in Brantford, and I hooked up the first 9 dealers, and it was a disaster. So it was a resounding success, but not architected to be successful. So it was collapsing based on the volume. Your covert earpiece is falling out. So at the time, and this is pre-internet, I had an idea for technology that would take a credit application, decision it, and send it back to these dealers. So roll forward to when I was in RBC Insurance, I tried to get the rights to a US software package that had this, and they said no. Roll forward to when I was at Canada Trust, I was at a conference to launch a leasing product. Your stereotypical conference with the white tablecloth, do you want chicken or beef? And there's a guy beside me who was an entrepreneur, and I said, somebody should just take this idea and run with it. And he said, well, actually, I have the technology. And he had built it for a company called Newcourt, which was a darling of the stock market at the time. And he, over time, convinced me to join him. And also a little bit, again, in that half crazy, I wasn't sure I was in a great position. I was just launching some really cool products at TD. And so I took a day off. I met with him at his house for the weekend and learned how to pitch the software. And I took the day off and I pitched the software to Mellon Bank in the US. I flew in with him and I did the pitch after a weekend because I wanted to see a major bank's, the whites of their eyes to see. Anyway, and then he wooed me in with basically cash to join him. That was a 20-person startup. Pretty funny as we get into my expat career, but he's like, oh, we're all open concept. It's great. You'll know everything that's going on. I was the only non-mainland Chinese person, and everybody spoke Mandarin in the office. So it was a crazy experience. I got it, unbeknownst to me, when he hired me, Newcourt was firing him. So the major client was going away. I got the product sold to National Bank and a US leasing company. And then he was running out of money and was a bit crazy. So I got the whole company sold to a publicly traded company called Microforum, did the roadshow to raise money, and was there for probably about 3 years. Again, lots of stories we could unpack there. the day we closed the deal, front page National Post headlines that the CEO of the company we'd sold to had a criminal record for drug trafficking. He'd flown a plane of cocaine across the border and done time, which is not great for getting our listing in the U.S. We never got listed in the U.S. So that was that chapter. And then as I saw the demise of the .com coming, I was headhunted into Manulife to drive e-commerce strategy. Thought, okay, I'll go hang out here while the .com meltdown happens for a little bit. And it became 30 years of insurance, living in 7 countries, working in dozens. We can go through that. I did 3 years in Japan, 3 years in Thailand as CEO of Manulife Thailand, 3 years in Hong Kong, regional CIO and COO, overseeing China, India, Philippines, Hong Kong, Indonesia, and the offshore operations in the Philippines and India. Then was hired to be CEO of ING Malaysia. Also a fascinating story in that ING took bailout money in the crisis and agreed to cut their balance sheet in half. So I signed on for the Eurasia IPO of the best ING insurance business in Asia. First day on the way to work, the CEO calls me and says, "Change your plans. We're selling Asia. What are you going to do?" I said, "Well, you hired me to lead, so that's what I'm going to do." And he told that story in head office the same day. Crazy experience. The agency force was unionized. They were trying to demand 10% of the sale price. They were striking, picketing, boycotting, threatening me, influencing the regulator. Stories I could tell you for days in there. We sold the business for 2.3, 2.4 billion, and they asked me to stay on as CIO back to the IT side in the Netherlands. So we moved to the Netherlands, and I again took an opportunity based on my background, a lot of which is around operational efficiency, and proposed to take $100 million off the balance sheet, 100 million euros off the balance sheet as part of the IPO. And I did that and delivered it. It was about 200 million in the end. From there was headhunted into Generali, to be head of applications for Generali. Most people would know Generali. It's 70 billion in premium, 60 countries. There was a regime change. My boss left, and I became the head of digital and COO for the group. But then that regime change continued to unfold, and the writing was on the wall that I might not survive it. They said they wanted me to survive it, but my parents were both not well, one dementia, one Alzheimer's, and came back to Canada. Did a bit of corporate stuff and had enough, and then started incubating with Highline Beta, which is a venture studio, and started to build Parachute.
Fantastic. So what about working overseas? And just what was that experience like? How do you see that now?
It was amazing. I think it was supposed to be 3 years and done to Japan.
Yeah.
So I had moved. So I joined Manulife in Toronto, moved to Waterloo, much to people's surprise. I was offered a job in Waterloo, and we moved to Waterloo. We had just renovated a house in Toronto, and I always said they'll take me out in a pine box while we were there for 18 months. They took us out in a cardboard box. And we were only in Waterloo for about 18 months as well. And the head of that business was asked to go to Japan and asked me if I'd go. And very glad we did. Amazing experience. 80-90% of my day was through an interpreter. I'd never been in the life side of insurance. And he offered me, and here's if you run into bosses that will give you the opportunity, run with it. So he believed in me. He gave me individual life product, pricing, marketing, communications at Japan, and operations. And it was great. Right. It was an amazing experience. And then instead of coming back, the offer was to be CEO of Manulife Thailand, which I went on to do. Our overseas experience was incredible, and it just kept moving. Most people don't usually move companies or countries, never mind both.
Right.
And I did that multiple times. Again, because it was opportunistic and I wanted the experience, I wanted the adventure. I'm probably a bit of a change junkie as a result. My brother used to joke with me all the time. He'd be like, "Oh, it's 2.5 years. Where are you going?" And adamantly, I would say every time, "No, I'm not." And then at 3 years, he'd be like, "Yeah, so there you go." So it was a great experience.
Yeah, exactly. Shout out to your wife.
Yeah. And but another interesting story, I don't even know if you know this, but so, while we were away, it's hard. So you have one that generally you call the trailing spouse. More often than not, it's the the wife. I don't want to be traditional in that sense. One partner is generally not working, and we had kids. So our son was 2 when we left. Our daughter was born in Tokyo. She went back to school and did a master's in Hong Kong in archival science, and then worked in some archives. But fundamentally, really, it wasn't practical to work, and we were only in these countries for 3 years. She came back, and now she started her own business. Everywhere we went, we had a 40-foot container of our stuff, and we'd be assigned an executive relocation consultant that would do housing, schooling, the whole 9 yards. And I would say to people, we could move with military precision, which we could, but it was all on her. So she's now started a business doing corporate relocation.
Oh, fantastic.
And it's going gangbusters.
Oh, fantastic.
I couldn't be more proud. Like she's and it's because it's her, and her challenge will be scaling because they want her. But she's done this 7 times. Like, find someone who's going to relocate you that's moved 7 times himself, with family, with pets, with little kids, with you name it. So,
that's so awesome. Well, that's great. No, I'm glad we dug into that. That just makes it so much more real, you know, about what it is like, again, taking a family all around the world so many times. So, but I know one of the big things we want to talk about is the whole, payday lending and the predatory lending space. So maybe you could just share, because I really don't think our leaders would really be all that aware of really what's going on in the world, and how I know, you know, challenging it is, damaging it is. You know, I can use that word.
Yeah, for sure. So I would guess that most of them might know their credit score. Which is a relatively new phenomenon, actually. And it's because the advent of free score in Canada was brought by Borrowell first. You can get your free credit score from Borrowell, ClearScore, Credit Karma. Essentially, if your score falls below around 700, now don't panic if, for the kids watching this, you have to build a score. So if you've not borrowed, or you may have a score below that. But fundamentally, if your score is below 700, and there's 8 million Canadians below 700, you need to deal with what the government or regulators would call a predatory lender generally, which means a high interest lender or a payday lender. And I have to be careful naming them, but if you walk up Yonge Street, you'll see them all. If you deal with high interest lenders, so you can deal with the, easy or Fairstone, and you're going to pay anywhere from 35 to 47% plus insurance and other things. That legislation is changing as of January 1st, 2025 to drop it to 35%. And if you go further damaged credit score, you have to deal with the payday lenders, which would be like Money Mart, Cash Money, some of those. With those players, it's per 100 borrowed for a short period. It's generally advertised as usually $15 per 100. That works out to anywhere between 300% and 400% annualized interest. So people get on this treadmill, and it's exceedingly difficult to get off. I mean, do the math, take a loan at 47%, and that's hard to pay back. And we should talk about some of the financial principles, but so there's a lot of people in this situation, and they haven't learned necessarily. Something happens, could be COVID, divorce, disability, job loss, whatever it is that puts some fractures in their financial situation. And once they get into this situation, it's exceedingly hard to get out.
Yeah. So there's this real challenging situation. And just so everyone understands, the TD, the RBC, those amazing banks were really well banked here in Canada, and that they have no interest, because they only want
don't touch the space.
They only want to have low risk loans that they're going to get an incredible return at, which I get. Like, well done, world-class banks. So they're not interested. So Bruce, crazy man Bruce, says, I'm looking to make a difference in this area. So what's the vision? What's the opportunity here?
Yeah. So the vision is changing the business model fundamentally. So I was trained as a lender. As you get into credit score, it's get a bit technical, but credit scores have a normal distribution. So pay attention in your stats class. Normal distribution.
Yes.
Everybody knows what that looks like. And the idea is you lend to the mean and as far left to the mean in score before you want a loss ratio. And you lend there because those are the people that are in debt and will always be in debt. And financial institutions are built to sell debt. So their job is to give you as much debt as they can to a certain threshold. And that's what happens in the predatory space, as well as the banks. Like, the banks want you to have a mortgage. They want you to have a credit card. They want a certain percentage to hold credit card balances. And we can talk about any number of those elements. But we're trying to get people out of debt.
Right.
So we want to get them, or not out of debt, but out of the predatory space. It's very difficult to survive at 30, 40% interest rates, never mind 400% interest rates. So we want to get people financially stable and back into a healthy credit score. So that's what we're focused on.
Okay. And so your early days. So, and, maybe we can talk about the progress that you've made, the model that you've set up so far.
Yeah. So we can talk about the raise. So we've raised over 2 million of venture funds through angels. We can talk about that. It's been a very difficult fundraising environment. We've lent more than $3 million. We have a $10 million line of credit with a third-party lender. And our coaching is going well. We have a metric where our customers can earn 10% of the loan back by self-assessing them against their own financial goals every month. And 70% of our customers have done that every month since we started. We do see a correlation with engagement in our application with an improvement in financial wellness, both qualitative and quantitatively. It's early days still, but it's all around behavioral science and behavior change. And I would strongly encourage people to look at behavioral science as well. It pertains to every business. It's an untapped element, and there's some great books that can be read on this. And it's how people, everything from how you communicate with them to changing behaviors fundamentally.
Okay, well, maybe pause there. I'm really interested as well. So where would you recommend? What would you point them to?
So one of my favorite books is called Hooked.
Okay.
Hooked is about using hooked behavior for good versus evil.
Okay.
How many times, the stats, how many times we check our cell phone every day? It's hundreds.
Yes.
It's because we're hooked. It's about using those hooked behaviors to change behaviors for good.
Right.
So ultimately, I said we have 70% of our customers engaged every month.
Yeah.
They are doing 8 to 10 activities in the dashboard every month. Ultimately, I want to get that to every day.
Yes.
And that is because to change behavior, it has to be front and center.
Yeah.
A good additional app is called Noom. Most of the listeners probably won't know what it is. It's a dieting app, but it's based on behavioral science. And it's using those hooked behaviors to keep people engaged to change. And if you get into physical health or mental health, you need a regular recurrence. So that's the behavioral science element.
Yeah, we are our habits.
100%.
So,
and behavioral science is all about habits and breaking habits or creating habits, as the case may be.
Yeah. Atomic Habits, Willpower, Kelly McGonigal, like a bunch of space there. Yeah, just amazing stuff. So,
and Nir Eyal is a guy that wrote Hooked, and he has a podcast, and he talks about everything from on habits and changing habits and lots of interesting stuff.
Yeah. So in terms of your next steps for your business, what's up for growth and opportunities for Parachute?
Yeah, so everything to date we built in B2B2C. So through ClearScore, Borrowell, Credit Karma, basically B2C, direct to consumer. Now we're working aggressively on a credit union consortium. Again, most people listening to the podcast probably don't know what credit unions are, which is a big shame. Credit unions in Canada are smaller institutions. Generally, there's 3 or 4 that are getting federal licenses. But the concept is they dividend all their profits back to their members. So if you open an account, you're a member, they dividend the profits back, they do things at far less profit, and they have a very strong social ethos. So we're looking to work with them, partner with them across Canada. So it's Parachute powered by, so which could be the same brand across Canada. The intent is, we've reached out to them and actually had them pull data on their clients that have high interest debt, and they have thousands each one. And I'm like, well, you're all about your customers. You're not meeting the promise on these customers. So we're about to kick off a pilot in November with one of the bigger ones to go after probably 1,000 members to start of theirs that have high interest debt, and they'll introduce us to help coach them back to good financial health. They win, we win. It's a great story.
Right. And again, it's these credit unions again care about. Again, not to say that other organizations don't, but that's really part of their mission driven about serving their customers in that area.
100%. Like, I am not a huge fan of the high interest lenders. That's no secret. No secret. But they are very well run companies. Mm-hmm. I mean, the largest publicly traded high interest lender in Canada is exceptionally well run. Mm-hmm. They are making 25.9% return on equity. It's one of the darlings of the stock market. You can make very good money. Mm-hmm. I would argue they're like the coal producers in the energy space.
Yes.
It's not taking into effect the environmental impact and the cost of their business because it's not factored in. But they're very well-run companies, and that makes them a force to be reckoned with in terms of being a contender to compete with.
Yeah, no kidding. So, I did want to spend some time talking about Parachute, but one of the things I really wanted to spend time is how do we make sure our leaders listening avoid ever needing to deal with Parachute? And we're cheering from the sidelines for Bruce and Parachute to really help serve this, this group of people who fall there, and hopefully away from these other groups. Yep. But what sort of strategies are really important?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, and it would be one of my big takeaways in terms of like lessons from my career is you need to be financially literate.
Yes.
And nobody wants to do it. They don't teach anything in business school, at least not that I'm aware of. They're adding it. I mean, the Ford government has added it to the curriculum in high school, which I think I don't know about what the course is or the details, but I think that's great progress. But fundamentally, people need to get educated and self-educated. And this is the place where procrastination will cost you millions of dollars.
Yes.
And that sounds like overblown, but I'll give a couple of examples. I think I did on the last time we spoke.
Yeah.
And the one that's probably most salient to this group is take two people. So you take two kids. The first one invests $2,000 from age 18 to age 25. And so $14,000, 7 years. The second one starts at 25 when the first one stops. And they invest $2,000 every year till they're 65 for 40 years. So they invest $80,000. The first one has more money.
Yeah.
They've invested. And the reason is, to another key rule, and everybody should like almost write this down, is the rule of 72.
Yeah.
And nobody teaches this. And the rule of 72 is a simple rule that is, take whatever interest rate or return you're getting on an investment and divide it into 72. And that's how many years it takes your money to double. And then if you figure out the math to the example I just gave you, is that first person gets one more doubling. And that doubling is the money doubles and doubles and doubles and doubles. So it's just a wedge. And every time you lose a doubling, your potential investment goes down exponentially.
Yeah.
It also speaks to, there's a risk return trade-off, obviously. You can, if you're in Bitcoin and you're getting 300%, there's a high risk. If you're in GICs getting 2%, there's no risk, but it's going to take you a lot longer to double. So you need to find that sweet spot. But the key is get started now. And, the temptation for the high producing managers is to go buy fancy cars and spend the money. You go spend 80 grand on a car.
What's the cost of that? Yeah.
Oh, take your age, go to whatever age you want to retire, and double that amount every 7 years.
Yes.
Like, it's huge.
Yeah.
So that BMW you're driving is going to cost you, I should have done the math before I came on, take 100 grand or whatever it is and double it every 7 years. So it goes 100, 200, 400, 800, 1.6 million. It's a pretty expensive ride.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things as well is that we're truth telling today, Bruce. Okay. We're truth telling. So let's tell what the truth is that there's a whole bunch of people out there who look like they're wealthy and they're not wealthy.
I would argue to say most people who look like they're wealthy are not
wealthy. There's a great book called The Millionaire Next Door. Millionaire Next Door. And millionaires drive 10-year-old cars and we drive 10-year-old cars. And so it's like driving.
Mine's only 6. But
that's right. Yeah. And it will be 10, so it's like getting that. That's not what we need to do to show people, oh, wow, look how successful I am.
It ties back to that original conversation we were having about, for whatever reason, we tie people's self-worth to money, which is why we don't want to talk about it. I know lots of friends who are like doctors, high-end specialists and so on, that are in debt up to their ears, and they're not getting out anytime soon. And that adds in an unbelievable amount of stress. Some of my we thought about this often in our expat careers. Like in Hong Kong, we had a 2,000 square foot apartment. Now that was not an inexpensive apartment. It was company provided, but you can live in 2,000 square feet.
Right.
Who in I mean, maybe for the people on the call, if you're buying condos and things, but go to the roof farms in the suburbs, right? Of the farms of roofs as you drive by them. Those are all like 3,000 square foot homes, and there's thousands upon thousands upon thousands upon thousands. Do people actually need that?
Yeah.
I mean, they're commuting farther to get there. They're spending more on their mortgage, on their car, on their mileage. Like, for what? And so you need to look at, how are you valuing you and what's important to you? And, I think there's a confidence that comes with having money, but you don't need to show it.
Yes.
Like, unless you're compensating for something.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a confidence and there's a security, right? It's like, wow, we're good. We're okay.
You've made it. And that feeling of getting into a new car with you can smell your leather seats and your fancy stereo and everything else. But, that wears off pretty quick.
Very fast.
And The Millionaire Next Door is a good book. Another great book is The Psychology of Money.
Yes.
Easy read. You can read it in a weekend. Talks about all these things. It's also a great book.
Yeah, I saw one of our coaches, OG, was taking up as a book club with his veterans. I was really super happy about that recently.
That's a great one.
Yeah.
For
just
sure.
why do we need the money, and what's the money we need, and just really looking foundationally at things. So any other ways that we should look at money, or that people are looking at money incorrectly, that we should share? Yeah,
I mean, another rule, and much to the chagrin, I try and impart these on my kids. I have a son who just graduated Dal and a daughter at St. FX. Great kids and very, very financially oriented, which is excellent. One of the ones I often use too is, and maybe a bit harder for this group, is in a situation where you're paid hourly.
Right.
Take your hourly wage after tax. So let's say you're making $20 an hour. After tax, it's going to be, I don't know, 12, 15, whatever that is. And anytime you make a purchase, mentally just divide it into what you're buying.
Right.
So you're going to buy a shirt, it's $180. Okay, well, you're going to work a day for that. Are you going to wear it a lot? Are you going to, right? So whatever you spend.
Yeah.
And second to that is try not to mortgage your future. So buy now, pay later, worst thing ever invented.
Yes.
Defaults are through the roof. And buy now, pay later, some people tout it as, a great financial maneuver. On paper, if you're absolutely perfectly paying it off, okay, maybe. But fundamentally, it's used for impulse purchases, quick buys, things that people don't need. There's other good strategies you can read about, like if you're online shopping, put it in your cart, leave it for 24 hours, and then come back and see if you still want it. There's so many games played, like Black Friday. Oh, it's a hype, and you're buying stuff on sale that you don't actually need or want, but you say, oh my God, that's such a good deal.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of things I would say read on it, because everybody listening is making good money, like great money for the age and stage. Done right, that can be game changing.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. Like, even if you only banked what you make in these years, and then you're not as successful in your career or whatever, that's going to carry you and change your lifestyle.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's understanding the psychology of buy now, pay later. The psychology is, oh, your life's going to be better. That's what people think, which is a great thing to think, by the way.
Yeah.
And so often it's not. And it's just a real high risk of, wow, I miss a day's payment, and bang, all of a sudden it's just so much more expensive, and I've really made a bad decision.
Yeah. Like, if you draw the parallel to business, which never happens, you really only ever take on debt in business if you're growing your asset.
Mm-hmm.
So it should almost be the same personally.
Right.
Okay, I get a mortgage.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, don't overbuy, don't over mortgage. A mortgage, you're not going to probably pay cash for a house. Maybe. That's probably almost, in the pure sense, the only thing you should ever finance.
Right.
Like, you shouldn't be financing a vacation or finance, because then you're getting behind the 8 ball, and you're going to you're going to enjoy it now, pay for it later, plus some.
Yes.
So again, take your vacation. Like, I'm not saying don't go on vacation and don't live.
Of course not.
I mean, I also would suggest you need to live, because like, you're not going to live forever, and you can't take it with you. But by the same token, figure out the absolute cost. Like, if you say, do I really want to take that trip?
Yeah.
Because if I threw $2,000 into my RSP, that's going to do that rule of 72 again. So weigh it off. Doesn't mean don't live, don't travel, don't do all these things. You need to do that, but just be judicious and think it through.
And find that value. And again, go buy a used car. you know. And,
do you need Uber Eats?
Yes.
I think I've ordered Uber Eats like twice,
Right.
which is funny. I took transit to get here.
Yeah.
And people, like some of my friends are like, wow, like you're taking transit. I live on Sherbourne and North, and I took the Sherbourne bus the other day. It's from downtown. It's a colorful ride.
Yes.
But I just look at it as I can travel for $3.
Yeah.
Why am I going to pay $15 for an Uber?
Right.
I just don't need to. And that's another $12 in my pocket. And people, both, it's like calories, right? I think most people are aware that calories add up and you gain weight. Money's the same.
Yeah.
And they say, oh, it's just Uber. Like if you look at your Uber bill, there's a surcharge, there's a delivery charge, there's a tip, right? Go pick it up, ride your bike, take TTC. I don't know. Like it sounds like I'm nickel and diming, but they add up.
Well, no, you're just pointing out to our leaders, here's how they're being nickeled and dimed.
Yeah.
Right.
We sometimes give incentives for quizzes and stuff like that. I've banned Starbucks. Mm-hmm. I will not give people rewards from Starbucks.
Right.
I was taking my daughter when she was choosing schools to go see Guelph. Yeah. And part of the tour was they talk about the on-campus Starbucks, and they're like, oh, I think the stat was like, it was almost told with pride, like we sell 20,000 cups of Starbucks every day. And I was like, that's horrible.
Yeah.
Like half of those people or 3/4 of those people have student debt.
Yeah.
Like why are they buying $7 coffees? They're not healthy to begin. Like there's triple latte, mocha, cappuccino, frappe, whatever it is. But if you take someone who drinks Tim Hortons, someone who drinks Starbucks, and somebody brews at home, and just take that and invest the difference, it's probably $1 million at the end of your life if you brew it at home. Like, I don't know, do the math. If you're spending $7 a day for 365 days a year times however many years invested and multiplied, it's a big number.
It's a big number. Yeah.
And do you really like Starbucks that much that when you're retired, you want to have several $100,000 less?
Yeah.
If you do, great. Enjoy your Starbucks.
Yeah. No, it's true. And it's just really thinking about these types of decisions. So pulling back, what things did you need to change about Bruce Hodges as you continued on your career to make the strides you've made?
It's interesting when I think back, and I was probably a little bit pensive even in the first questions talking about my own situation.
Right.
And I think my parents, as a parent, you're a parent, you make decisions. I think they thought they were doing the right thing to prove a point. Memory is infallible. It taught me a lot.
Yes.
Right or wrong, it taught me a lot. And here I am trying to disrupt the very space that I think I was victim to.
Yes.
So learn these lessons early. There's learnings at all stages of my career.
Yeah.
Each one of them shaped who I was. The expat assignments, some failure. Yeah. I mean, lots of, one of my favorite stories also is back in the TD days. I was working in the basement of the bank branch. I'd graduated from Laurier. And that bank branch, it was in Kitchener, was stratified. So the basement was clerical, which is where I was. I was doing virtually what you'd call data entry. It was mostly women and I, still back, this is 80s, so still, but second careers. And the first floor was the main branch and the personal lenders. And the second floor was the commercial lenders. So there was almost like a pecking order.
Yeah.
And the guy that was my roommate was on the commercial floor. And then they found out that I had a business degree. And they started treating me differently. And then I got hired into management training and they took me for lunch. And I was like, I never want to be that. And that's, stay humble. It's tied to also not flashing your money, et cetera. Yeah. Like you got to think about, what do you want to be? Like, what is your purpose? What is your ethos? What do you want to represent? Mm-hmm. And live that. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, for me was a lesson of, I don't want to be that. And I think probably some of my lessons were because I got kicked in the pants with my own personal finance. I don't know. Who knows? I might have, I wish I could live my life like Groundhog Day and find out where I went. There's another a good book on this by Clayton Christensen called How Will You Measure Your Life?
Yes, great book.
A great book. And he talks about his Harvard analogy, and he went to reunions every year. In the beginning, they're all full of vim and vigor and everybody's excited. And then over time, people get divorced. They didn't plan to get divorced. And then some of them went to prison because of, in that case, it was Enron, et cetera. They didn't plan that. They didn't envision that. Your life will carry on based on the seeds you sow early on, your reputation and how you decide consciously to be a human and exist in the world.
Right, right. And so when you mean you don't want to be that person back at the TD Bank, which person?
The person that treats you differently based on your level, based on the car you drive, or based on how much money you have. Like it's just a sad reality of, I know society's wired kind of that way.
Yeah. No, it always surprises me. One thing that they'll say about people, wow, he or she treats people just like the CEO or the garbage man, all the same, and I go, well, why would we treat someone differently, right? Why would we, not be respectful and kind to everybody, right? Like that's just, you're so right. And you're right. Like getting clear about your values, getting clear about what really matters. That's and then, okay, let's, as best we can, because we're not perfect, keeping our ladder on that wall as 100% often as possible.
And, it comes from a variety of places, your parents, what you learned, some of it's cultural. When I took over the India Service Center for Sun Life, I remember a funny day, and I was in the washroom and the guy was struggling a little bit. He didn't speak very well, and he couldn't read. And I came out and I talked to the management. I said, couldn't we have a program or something? But it's very caste driven. They're like, for what? Like, really? Like, he's a cleaner.
Right.
And there's some heritage there of, and I think, you should have those kind of programs, and you should try and buck the trend of what we were raised on.
Right. Right. And so what about habits? I know you talked about habits earlier. What sort of habits do you have that really support you and that might be worthwhile talking about?
So this would be do as I say, not as I do. One thing I wish I was better at that I go in fits and spurts would be my physical health and staying in shape and trying to make the time. And I try and encourage our kids to do this, because if you get in that habit and keep and sustain that habit, because when you break that habit, it's hard to get it back. And as you get out of shape, I am not great at this. I work constantly, always have worked constantly. And, it'll catch up with you. Yeah. And if you can it sounds funny, and I know it's hard for younger people to even envision it, but if you build that in as part of your practice, eating healthy, again, you're working all the time, easy to stop at McDonald's. Yeah. And when you're younger, it's not going to show. Yeah. But it's not great. So try and figure, and it would tie back to your finances too. Pack your lunch. Yeah. Yes. Right. Save money and stay healthier. Yeah. So those, that's a bit of do as I say, not as I do. Stay on top of the finances again, not to overplay that. Yeah. And invest in your personal relationships as well.
Yes.
And again, last thing probably would be tie it back to that reputational thing. It's, the old expression, it's what you do when people aren't looking. That tells you your own character.
Yes.
And, these things will come back to haunt you. Like a crazy story the other day, I was pitching a credit union, one of the first ones I pitched. And we stopped in the middle of the meeting and the guy said, "I know you." And I'm like, not sure. And we went, I couldn't figure it out because a lot of my career is overseas. And why is some guy in the middle of northern Alberta, why would he know me? Turns out he's like, we figured it out. It was at TD Bank. In the time when I was in my first branch as a personal lender trainee. And he's like, "I remember you so distinctly. You always came in, pressed white shirt, always well-spoken." And that is one of the best examples of that was 1991.
For sure.
That's a long time ago.
Yeah.
And it's still sharp in his mind.
Yes.
And as a result, he's dealing with me.
Exactly. Yes. Right? And again, it's like things like that would have someone not dealing with someone, right? It's like, 100%. Hey, this is who Bruce shows up. And again, it's funny because I'm sure your impression, it's the same. It's like, Bruce is Bruce, exactly who you were back in 1986. And, it matters. It just so matters.
It matters.
And Yeah, no, I guess I lost track of my, just to share the one key why people work out is, again, reading lots of books is because they're going to feel better that day, not because of the goal about looking good or something. It's getting attached to the endorphin rush, getting attached to, I worked out in the morning, I feel better. So just for our leaders listening, that's what we want to connect to. And again, long-term health makes all the difference.
You can connect these to the short term.
Yes.
Yeah. Play the long game, but also look at the short term, and you will. Yeah. I mean, I don't know about you, but if I go eat at McDonald's, I feel terrible after, and you're not going to have as much energy, which means just from a pure business sense, you're not going to do as many calls. You're not going to close as many deals.
Yeah.
You're not going to be as happy with your team, and so on.
Exactly. So final question. What would you say to someone who is considering joining StudentWorks?
Don't do it. Great experience. Absolutely. Be sufficiently worried about, can you do it?
Yeah.
You can do it, by the way. And the training, the guardrails are there. All the tools are there that you need. And I'm a big proponent. We talked about some of it. A lot of my career and skills comes from that, whether it's presentation skills or sales skills or closing skills or team management skills, or some of this stuff will probably feel very uncomfortable, and that's perfect. Yeah. So I would definitely do it.
Yeah. Well, Bruce, thanks so much for your generosity to the program. I'm just so appreciating. Let's go have dinner.
My pleasure. Sounds great.